Well, welcome to our first class of the new year. You asked me when the test is going to be on chapter 8. It is tomorrow, so we have to really get with it here. All right, let's do some review.
I'm so prepared.
I'm glad. Well, let's get you prepared as fast as we can. I need to tell you a few things, and then I'm going to stand you in lines and quiz you on it. We're going to film this whole thing for anyone who's absent today so they can get in on the review. Okay, first of all, let's look for a minute at Charlemagne. Charlemagne was part of your chapter, Charles the Great, and he hired someone to set up an educational system in his kingdom. Who did he hire? Does anyone know who he hired? Alcuin, A-L-C-U-I-N, Alcuin. And he set up a series of the humanities, like he decided what the courses would be, and a lot of those courses were used in medieval Europe in the universities as they developed. Charlemagne also had a significant crowning. Why was his crowning ceremony as king significant?
He was crowned by Pope.
Yes. He was crowned by Pope Leo III, so big deal. A pope crowned him. What does that mean?
He went against authority and made himself higher than the king.
Okay, the pope was signifying that he was above the king. He was the one that would crown Charlemagne the king. And this was the beginning of strong church power and church leaders having authority over kings. That was disputed and fought against over and over, but it stayed pretty strong through most of the Middle Ages. Now, we had a certain thing that we learned about serfs and fiefs and manors. All that had to do with what system? Feudalism, exactly. Now, feudalism was a really smart idea for its time. One of the biggest problems in medieval society was they had no what department?
Police.
No police department. You couldn't dial 911. And if somebody came through your little village, and these villages could be in the middle of the woods, and it said that if you could have flown over Europe at that time, you would have seen all treetops and not very many of the villages, maybe a little smoke coming up. But if someone rode through your village and burned your houses and stole your daughters and, killed them in, too bad for you. So bad guys were a real terror in this time period. So this gives us an idea why certain people would bind themselves to the land of a noble. Why would they do that?
To give themselves protection.
For protection. And what were those people called?
Serfs.
Serfs. So the serfs bound themselves to the land, put themselves under the authority of their lord so that they could have that protection. They could even, if they had a castle on a big manor or a castle on the estate, they would even let women and children come there during an attack. You saw a little bit about the feudal system and how it worked. Who can tell me the hierarchy of the feudal system? Yes.
Oh gosh, is it like kings, liege lords, vassals, knights, serfs?
Kings, liege lords, vassals, you missed one. What is it, guys? Knights, and then, did you bring my phone by any chance? Oh, bummer. Okay. Anyway, so that was the hierarchy, and the serfs were at the bottom. Now, the king was supposedly at the top, but what eventually, by the 1200s, made the liege lords stronger than the king?
Because the king didn't have knights.
Right. The armies were put together by these feudal estates. So in each section of the estate, the liege lord would give each of his vassals a piece of property, and that vassal would owe him certain things, and one of them was soldiers in time of war. So sometimes where there's the muscle, there's the might, right? There's the leadership. And so when it came to, as you're going to learn in a little bit, when it got to be 1215, the knights rebelled against King John. We're going to learn about that later. But the church was the power. The feudal system was the protection. And then we learned in this section how towns were formed. Who can give me an overview of how towns were formed? What did it start with? What did it start with when towns were formed?
Like a treaty.
Okay, trade fairs. Now, how did people get to trade fairs? Did they, hop on the train, or how did they get there? They had to walk to these trade fairs or bring wagons or animals that carried their burdens. And what kind of people came to trade fairs? Merchants and artisans that wanted to sell their wares, farmers who wanted to sell their crops. They would all get together, and it was like a big swap meet or something. They'd set up their stations, and a lot of times people would trade this for that. And pretty soon somebody got the idea, why should I travel back and forth? Now the farmers had to travel back and forth because they needed to have a lot of land, but the artisans started thinking, why should I make this journey every year? Why don't I just live in this spot? And, pardon?
Sorry.
That's okay. What did you say?
They set up towns.
Okay, they started building homes there and businesses. And usually these trade fairs were at major crossroads or near a castle. So they started building these towns. Now in the towns, to be a town, they had to get what from the king? A town what?
Oh.
Sign it off.
The king's approval to be a town came in the form of a town what? Charter. Charter. Can you remember that? A town charter. And these charters would give them permission to operate as towns, and it was when towns were formed that a middle class began to grow, because there had been in the feudal system the serfs at the bottom, the church and royalty at the top, even the knights were near the top, but there wasn't really a strong middle class. And this is when the middle class began to form, and they formed in the persons of merchants, and merchants began to thrive and grow and make money. And in each town, the merchants would get together and form what? What did they form to protect their business? Guilds. And if you were going to do a certain business in that town, you had to be a member of the guild to do it. So these guilds had a certain amount of power. If you wanted to work for a guild, you were a young man and you wanted to work for a guild, what would your position be called? Apprentice. And then if you went on to be good enough that you'd get more than room and board and start getting paid, what would be the next step? A journeyman. And then you could also sometimes be the master of the guild. Now guilds operated on the basis of connections a lot of times. If you had a connection with someone, you could get in and work for a guild. Just like things are today, connections are helpful. Later, we're going to see how those guilds, that kind of having to have a connection in that elite circle of the guild started to fall apart after the Black Death, and people that were of lower class and didn't have connections started moving into these positions because the population decreased so much. And we'll learn also more about that later. So we've learned about Charlemagne. We learned about the feudal system. We learned about the development of towns. And did we not also learn the agricultural revolution in this chapter? Was this the chapter for that? Good, because I don't have the book open in front of me, but I'm pretty sure this was the chapter where we learned the agricultural revolution. Now we have towns developing, and I don't see anything on here about that. You sure that wasn't the last chapter?
It's on page 3.
Okay, so we have it. All right, let's talk about the agricultural revolution. This was a big deal. And what effect, first before we talk about what caused the agricultural revolution, let's talk about what effect that revolution had on the people. Who can tell me what the effect was? Yes?
They were able to have like a steady or food supply. So
right, and then what happened? Rachel, do you know what happened because of that?
Not because I don't know what happened.
Okay, yes.
larger population.
Right, and the population doubled. Now let's look at what caused it. First of all, we had men, farmers, plowing the ground with wooden plows, and these wooden plows would break easily when they hit a rock. What came along that made that more efficient?
The iron plow.
The iron plow, which was stronger. Okay, what was another part of the agricultural revolution? What page did you say it was on?
3. The windmill.
The windmill, page 3.
Page 3 of the.
Oh, okay. All right, so the windmill, that was another thing. Who can tell me another thing that happened? Right. How were they, now when they had the wooden plow, they had to have the plow pulled by oxen. And the reason they had to have the plow pulled by oxen is because they had a wooden yoke that they had to put the oxen head in, and ox skin is tough enough that they could pull that wooden yoke and not hurt themselves. What was the change that all of a sudden, oh, first of all, why couldn't they hook horses up to those things? Yes?
Because their skin was weak, so like tear them apart.
Yes, they were too delicate and their skin would tear. So what was invented that made this change possible? The harness, the soft harness for horses. So we now have a iron plow that won't break as easily, and horses so we can go faster. So we're faster and we're not stopping all the time to fix the plow. So plowing became easier. Then when the grain was grown, it had to be processed. For example, wheat had to be ground into flour, and that was done at a mill. Where were all the mills built originally? By moving water, so the water power could turn the wheels. No electricity yet, so we had to have some power to turn that wheel, to turn the grindstone inside the mill house to grind the grain. And when you go on the U.S. history tour next year, you are going to love when we visit a real mill. It's very fascinating. The millstone part is very fascinating. It gives new meaning to the text. It's better to have a millstone thrown around, put on your neck and thrown in the water. It gives a lot of new meaning to that. But now they had a new way to grind grain without water power, and it was what kind of power? Wind. They realized that they could also get a wheel or a windmill to turn in the wind, and that would turn the grinding mill. That made it possible for them to take this excess grain and get it ground, because mills by water were limited, but now they could build mills that ran on air power. There was another part of this agricultural revolution that was really important, still used today, and that is the way they planted. What was it called?
Was it crop rotation?
Crop rotation, or the three-field system. The three-field system was to have 3 fields and to rotate your crops. For example, you have field 1, you plant corn, field 2, you plant beans. Corn takes different nutrients out of the soil than beans might take. So the next year you move your beans to plot number 3, which had just been empty for a year, your corn to plot number 2, and then you let plot number 1 rest for a year. It is in leaving the ground to rest a year that nutrients are built back up in the soil. So by giving every 2 years a piece of ground had a chance to rest for a year, their crops were bigger and healthier. Also, rotating corn and beans to other fields didn't rob the nutrients as quickly. So you would have corn, beans empty, and then you'd move it, and you'd have beans here, corn here, and empty there. So that was a really good idea, to have the crop be healthier and bigger. So look at what's happening. No wonder the population develops. Population always matches food supply. So look at what a big deal this was. You're plowing faster so you can plant more, and you're plowing better because of the iron plow. You're rotating your crops so what you plant is more plentiful and healthy, and you can process all that excess because you now have mills that are run by wind. So this was the agricultural revival, and that's what made the trade fairs so popular. We had all this food, there was more people had needs. If you farmed all day in the field, did you have time to make a pair of shoes? Farmers usually work in that time period, especially from sunup to sundown. So how did they get shoes?
By the tailor, or not the tailor, the shoemaker.
The shoemaker. So how did they pay for those shoes? They traded their food for shoes, and that's what trade fairs were all about. Now there were some changes also in commerce that were very helpful. One of the problems is when people were traveling to trade fairs or different things, there would be robbers along the highway. Always have to deal with them, don't we? Always there's people that try to profit off of the work of others. Don't have a lot of respect. Pardon?
Even still to this day, I bet.
That's right. And so we had robbers to contend with, and if the person had money, of course the robber would take all the money. What did they do to prevent that? How did they make it so that travelers did not have to carry cash and money on them?
It was like insurance.
They had insurance. A bill of exchange. So they could put their money in a bank in one city and then go to another city where a cooperative bank would give them that money for the bill. There was another thing that started. Money lenders would give people capital to start business. What is capital?
Like loan money.
Okay, capital, if I'm going to start a business, I need to have money to start it before I can make money from the business. In other words, I can't just start running the business and get the money until I set the business up. And setting the business up takes money that you didn't get from the business itself, and that is called capital. So let's say I want to open a store. I have to buy a building and I have to stock the store. I need money for that. If someone will give me the money to start it, and if my store is profitable, I can start paying them back that money. So capital became available for people to start businesses. Another thing that lowered the business risk, of course, was the insurance and partnerships. People started realizing if I go into a business with a partner or several partners, if this business goes belly up, we share the loss. If it does well, we share the profit. So those were things that were a commercial revolution that helped people to start businesses with more confidence. Now the guilds, we talked about becoming a guild member and the role of the guilds. You've already named the different positions in the guild. And the guilds were to prevent competition, and they would limit membership in the guild. And no one except guild members could work in any trade in that town. So that was sort of a monopoly for them. All right, there was one other thing that I wanted to look at in this section, and that was how the Jews were treated in Europe. Did people like the Jews in general? No. Now in Spain, when the Muslims conquered Spain in 710 or 11, they had tolerance for the Jews and for Christians. And they would have them working in the court and being advisors. They let people have freedom of religion, which is interesting because we have a sect of Muslims today who would never do that, right? That's not all Muslims. There are Muslims that are still like the Muslims of Spain were, that you can believe and practice what you want. But of course the jihadists don't believe that. But at this time in Spain, the Muslims were very tolerant. Then along came Ferdinand and Isabella and kicked them out of Spain and became very intolerant of anybody that was not only not a Christian, but not a Catholic Christian, and we'll learn more about that. But at this time, in the rest of Europe, there was a spirit of hatred toward the Jews. They were called Christ killers. If you do not like Jews, if you're prejudiced against Jews, what is the word we use to describe that? Anti-Semitism, yes, anti-Semitism. So that word you need to know, and that reared its ugly head in horrible ways when the Black Death hit, and we haven't gotten there yet. Now we had an agricultural reform, we had a commercial reform, we also have a church reform. This is really interesting. The church started to structure what it needed people to do and grow in wealth and power. And the Cluniac form was one of them. And this was done by Abbot Bruno of Cluny. And what he did is, in the monasteries and stuff, he revived the Benedictine rule. Who could tell me what the Benedictine or Benedictine rule said? It had 3 parts to it. Okay, a monk was supposed to practice everyone. What was the first one she said? Obedience, poverty, chastity. Obedience to the head abbey and to God, to the head abbot. Poverty, you're not working for money, you're working for the common good of the people and to serve God. That's why monasteries sometimes would have schools for young boys, or they would do services to the poor, or run hospitals. Some of the nunneries ran hospitals, so it was really great. And chastity means that you could have no sexual relationships with another human being, so marriage was out. So you stayed single as a monk and as a nun. So the first reform was the Cluniac reform. But then there were a couple of really neat guys who started some some preaching orders, and one of them was Saint Francis of Assisi. What were the monks that followed him called?
Assisi something.
No, Franciscan for Saint Francis of Assisi. And then there was another Spanish monk, and his name was Dominique, and what were his friars called? Dominican, and the friars that were inspired by Francis of Assisi were called Franciscan monks. All right, Francis of Assisi, by the way, if you ever read anything he wrote, a very interesting person. Francis of Assisi, and this is just an aside, came from a very wealthy family and gave that all up to follow his convictions. And he has a great life philosophy, which he sums up in something called the Prayer of St. Francis. And listen to this and see if you think these are really great goals. He says, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is, what's the next one? Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is distress, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sorrow, joy. So you went around sowing all those things. Would that make you a neat person?
Yeah.
Okay, people would like you because you'd be a bearer of light. The rest of the prayer says, O divine majesty, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console. What does that mean? Let me not seek for everybody around me to comfort me and pamper me. Let me be one of the ones who's comforting. Then he says, to understand is to be understood is to understand. So he says, help me to be the one who's understanding, not to be always seeking for everyone to understand me. And it goes on like that. So he was a very insightful and interesting man, one of the servants in this world, one who cared about others. All right, I think we've covered a lot of what you need to know. So what we're going to do is form two teams, and I'm going to drill you on some of this information, and we're going to go ahead and continue to film this because I think it'll help the students who are absent. I hope we can get this downloaded tonight so they can go to. Who's missing today?
Maddie.
Is Maddie sick? Okay, so she might not be back tomorrow anyway. And who else is missing? Yvonne. Okay, Maddie will. What about Yvonne? Is he going to be back tomorrow? Yeah, they'll probably want an extra day for the test. All right, one of the other hierarchies that we had was in the knighthood. You started out a lot of times serving a knight. What was the person who served his knight called?
An apprentice?
A squire.
Oh.
Yeah, a squire. And he would, they would start training as a squire at the age of as early as 7, and then they could rise to be a knight.
Liege, lord, vassals, knights, serfs.
What's another name for the vassals?
Lesser lord.
Lesser lords. So really, they're also lords, but they're not as important as the liege lord. Okay.
Vassals, can you say kings then lords? Or do you have to say liege lords?
Well, if you're going to divide the lords into two groups, you're going to have a different name. So you could say lords and vassals, but liege lord would be the most accurate. Number 1, Joy. Who was the man who set up a school curriculum under Charlemagne? Yes, Alcuin. Did you get that, everyone?
I don't know. This one's Alcuin.
Alcuin. A-L-C-U-I-N. Aha, let's go over here. Do you know what the code of behavior is called for knights? The code of what? Chivalry, that is correct. All right, this one we didn't talk about today, but let's see if you can do it. What was the penalty that barred Christians in the church from receiving the sacraments? What was that called? Excommunication. Excommunication, or that's when they were kicked out of the church. But what was it called when the Pope put this thing on a city and no one could have the sacraments until the problem was fixed? Do you know? It begins with I-N, like you said, but do you know the word?
I said X, not
No. What is it? Okay, you two go to the back. What is it, Rachel?
I have no idea, but I want to say like simony or something like that.
Nope.
What's the question?
The question is, what do you call it when a pope puts restrictions on a city and they can't have the sacraments?
Oh, God.
Begins with I-N. I already told that. Okay, I'm going to tell everyone, please remember this. It's called an interdict. Yes, an interdict. And that means that they can't study the sacrifices. Have the sacraments. Okay, back over here. What's the word you call money for investment?
Oh, a capital.
Capital, right. Riley, you go to the back. Over here. Who did Pope Leo III crown? Charlemagne, that is correct. Over here, who pledged their service to the liege lord? Who's under the liege lord? Knights? Nope, you missed one. Who pledged service to the liege lord? Who was a person who pledged service? Okay, go to the end. Not the serfs, it's one step below. Who is it? Okay, go to the back. Amara? The vassals, yes. The lesser lords would give a pledge of service to the...
You said serfs.
Serfs is not it. Okay, serfs...
Talking about the lesser lords.
But you said serfs, so that doesn't the right answer. Okay.
That's still not right, it'd be knights.
What would you call the earliest trainee in a guild? An apprentice, yes.
Everyone else get really.
I know.
Okay. What do you call it when you pay a 10% tax to the church? Tithes, that is correct. What religion appeared in Arabia in 622?
You know that.
Wait, the Muslim religion.
Yes, that is right. That was part of this.
You overthinking.
Samantha, a liege lord would grant his vassal an estate or a piece of property. What was that called?
A manor?
The manor was on it, but the piece of property was called what? Nope, there's another word. What? The question is, what do you call the piece of land that the liege lord gave to his lesser lords?
Is F
Uh-huh.
I-F?
Yes, a fief. A fief. She got it. All right, a fief. What is a fief?
A land that is granted to the serfs.
Okay, does everyone have that one? Because we're going to do this again. What would be a written document that described the town's rights? It was granted by a king to a new town. What was it called? Nope. What was it called? A document. Okay, Samantha, do you know what it was called? Oh, wait, are you still up?
Yeah.
Okay, you're next. What was it called? The document that was granted to a town describing their rights, it was granted by the king. It was called a town what?
Oh.
Samantha, do you know?
No.
Charter. A town charter. A charter, C-H-A-R-T-E-R, was a document that the king granted to the town to tell them what their rights were and to say, you can become a town now. All right, let me go back to the top. Samantha, are you next? Okay, Samantha, what did you call the code of behavior for knights? It was called the code of...
Conduct?
It was a code of conduct, but it had another name. The code of, also begins with a C. And you hear it, you're going to go, oh, I knew that. Code of, do you know what it is? Okay, it's chivalry. The code of chivalry. Okay, now over...
Can you repeat the question?
The code of conduct for knights was called the Code of Chivalry. C-H-I-V-A-L-R-Y. Chivalry. Okay, here's one I asked last time. Winnie, do you remember what the penalty was that barred Christians from being able to take part in the sacraments? In other words, the Pope would put this on a town and they couldn't practice their religion. Everyone missed it last time. Do you remember what it is? Do you remember? Interdict. Interdict. Okay. Okay. What did you call The earliest position in a guild, when a boy joined a guild to be trained, what was he called? Begins with A. Don't remember? Do you know? Shauna.
Apprentice?
Oh, yeah, Samantha. Apprentice. Yes, that is correct. All right, everybody up again. Everybody up.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, well,
Well, I want you guys to have some practice. Okay, listen carefully. Shh, 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 shh. Listen, because I'm going to tell you a couple more things that I'm going to be asking this time. Listen in case you get this question. What do we call something that is worldly?
worldly.
Something that is worldly.
Yeah, worldly things are called,
Earthly.
not to do with the church, they're called secular. That's right, secular. We talked about Charlemagne, but who was the early Frankish leader who was converted to Christianity by his wife? No, he was a king, and he was converted by his wife to Christianity. His name begins with a C. Does anyone know? Clovis. That is correct. Clovis. Okay, so who's the German that was converted to Christianity by his wife?
Clovis.
Who's the German that was converted to Christianity by his wife? Clovis. Clovis. Okay. Next question. What do we call this side? What do we call it when something is worldly? Secular. Okay, another new thing. Lending money at interest.
Oh,
What is it?
bill of exchange. Oh,
No.
charter.
No, that's a town thing.
Can you repeat the question? Because they said something about partnership, how they like.
Okay, it's called usury. It was one of your blue words. Usury. Now listen to the reason behind this. Can I have your attention? I'm doing this to help you, so. Well, that's okay. All right. When you lend money to someone and you charge them interest, you are using them. So it's called usury. You are taking advantage of their need to make money. So it was called usury. In the early church, in the early Christian church, that was frowned upon. If someone needed to borrow money, you helped them and they paid you back the exact amount. But when you charged them interest, it was called usury. Does that make sense? You're using them to make money. All right, that might help you remember.
You said that's a blue word?
I think it was in your text, and one that's blue that has a definition. I'm not sure. But anyway, usury. Okay. What was simony? Does anyone remember that?
Selling of churches.
Selling church offices, simony. That's good. Okay. All right. Another thing is, what were the guidelines that we talked about that the Cluniac reform started that kind of guided monastic life? What was that called? Those guidelines. There were 3 of them. What were they called? Pardon? Benedictine rule. Remember that? There were 3 of them. Raise your hand if you can tell me what the 3 were. The 3 rules of the Benedictine rule.
oh,
Raise your hand if you know what they were. Raise your hand if you could name at least 2 of them. Okay. This is what they are. What's one of them, Rachel?
Obedience.
Obedience. What's the next one?
poverty.
Poverty. And the last one, Amara? Chastity. Obedience, poverty, chastity. Or you could say poverty, obedience, and chastity, and that would spell POC. Okay. All right. And the other thing was mock battles between knights. Like when they weren't at war, they would have these mock battles.
Yeah,
Tournaments. All right. All right. I'm going to start over here. All right. Number 1. Who was the German ruler who was converted to Christianity by his wife? Clovis. Very good. Who set up a curriculum for Charlemagne? An educational curriculum. What was his name? Who was it?
what does he start with?
A?
No.
A. Apricots.
Okay. No. Alcolunus Aquinas? No. Who was the one that set up a curriculum for Charlemagne in his empire?
It's It's Aqua.
Alque?
Alcuin or something?
Alcuin, that's right, Alcuin. How do you spell that? How do you spell it? Wait, tell me, guess, Alcuin. How do you think you spell it?
Alcuin. Alcuin.
Perfect, okay. What was the penalty that Bart, which side am I on?
This one. That one.
Okay, over here. Oh, who crowned Charlemagne as king? Samantha, who crowned Charlemagne as king?
I know.
Yes, that's right, a pope. Do you know his name?
No.
Do you know?
Okay, well, I'll give you that. Who was his name? Leo III, Samantha. Remember that, Pope Leo III.
Okay.
All right, over here. Young nobles trained in riding, warfare, and chivalry were called? Yes. Okay. Religion that started in Arabia in 622 was? Shh, quiet. Yes, the Muslim religion. It's called Islam. You got it right. Okay. The people are Muslims. The religion is Islam. All right. A lord would grant his vassals a piece of property or an estate called what?
Is it, that was the first. The. You had this question before.
What's the question?
Stop cheating, Kindy.
Yeah. No discussion. What was it called? A piece of land granted by the Lord to his vassals. What was that property called? Joy, it's your chance. Fief. F. Okay. How do you spell that? Does anyone know? F-I-E-F. F-I-E-F, but it's pronounced fief. Okay, over here to Shauna. What was the written document that the king gave a new town? Charter, that is correct. Over here. What were mock battles between knights called? Tournaments, that is correct. Over here. No, you won't. Lending money at interest to make money off of other people was called what?
Capital.
No, lending money for interest was called.
Oh, the usury.
Is she right? Is it usury? Yes, she's right. Over here.
Oh no.
What did you call the association of merchants and artisans in a town?
Wait, what do you mean like a guild?
Yes, a guild. That's exactly what I mean.
Because I didn't know exactly.
What do you call it in the Catholic Church when they kick someone out of the church?
Guild.
Logan?
Shh, 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 shh.
Let me.
When they kick someone out of the church, what's that called? This is kind of a common knowledge question. She doesn't know. Do you know? Okay, what is it, everyone? Excommunication. Excommunication. It means you can't communicate with the church anymore. You're out, X'd out, okay? Here's one for the audience. What were the officials called that Charlemagne sent out to his kingdom to do business for him?
Missi Dominici.
Missi Dominici. Missi Dominici. Okay, everybody up? Oh, you know what? Sit back down because we have 3 minutes and I want to give you, get a pen, paper, and I'll tell you some things you need to know for the test. Okay, here we go. You need to know about the Battle of Tours. Write that down. The Battle of Tours, T-O-U-R-S. Sure. You need to know what noble women were allowed to do in that period. What noble women were allowed to know, and you need to know the Battle of Tours. This is besides the things we just studied. You need to know a little bit about St. Francis, what your book says about St. Francis before he set up his order of Franciscans. Okay, I'm looking for things I didn't tell you yet.
So what do we need to know about St. Francis?
You need to know a little bit about his life. It's in your book, a little bit about his life. You also need to know that when you lended money for interest, you were looked down upon as someone who used people. What's that called?
Usury.
And since people thought that was a low-class job, the only ones that could do it were the Jews. The Jews were the ones that were the money lenders. You need to know that. You also need to know what canon law is, C-A-N-O-N. You need to know where the Vikings came from and where they settled in Europe, which was in France. They called it Normandy, France, because they were Norsemen. You need to know what simony is, but we already covered that. And the last thing is you need to understand the agricultural revolution, the 4 things that caused it, and be able to describe them. You need to describe to me that why the iron plow helped the revolution, why the horse harness helped the revolution, why the windmill helped, and why the 3. So you need to know those well. All right? Any questions?
Nope.
Now, I didn't repeat all the things we just drilled on. You do need to know those. So I think if you know those things, you're going to do a good job. It's tomorrow. If you possibly can, yes, you have an essay. If you possibly can, study it early, like today, study a few things, and then as soon as you get home, and then again, if you can put space between your study time, you will do better, yes.
But we don't have a question for essay. Is the essay going to be about the agricultural?
I didn't tell you what the essay is about, but you do have one. Yeah, and it's about some of the things we talked about. It could be about the feudal system. It could be about, some of the things we talked about will be your essay.